Hello, I'm Li Hao. Today I'm going to talk about Svelte Compiler API. We know of Svelte is a compiler, or kind of know about Svelte is a compiler because I've been on and on saying that you write your Svelte component and then Svelte will transform it into JavaScript, right? So that process is called a compilation. You compile your code that you've written in one language or something into another thing, which is JavaScript in this case. So the Svelte compiler compiles the Svelte component code that you write into plain JavaScript that a browser then can execute. Right. So most of the time when we interact with Svelte, for example, import get context, import create event dispatcher from Svelte, we are interacting with the sort of like the client side of Svelte, which is the runtime of Svelte, the code that actually runs in your browser. But today we're going to talk about one step back, which is how the part of Svelte, which is the compiler part, how do we use it to convert your Svelte component into JavaScript code? Right, so we're going to take a look at how we can use the Svelte compiler. Okay, so in most of the time you wouldn't have to do this because most of the time you will probably be using some bundling tools, some build tools that you're using, for example, Rollup or Webpack, and there's already a Rollup plugin or Webpack loaders that can handle those for you. But you know, it's never there's nothing wrong to learn something else that how this plugins works under the hood, right? So eventually these plugins, for example, Svelte Rollup plugin, or Rollup Svelte plugin, or Svelte loader in Webpack, under the hood they're still using the Svelte compiler API to compile your Svelte component code to JavaScript code, right? So we're going to take a look at how that is being used, what are the options that can be used, and probably some scenarios of how you can use them, right? So let's take a look at some examples right now. So here on the screen that I have is a very basic setup. You can see that I have on the left, I have 4 files, right? So I think 3 of the files that you just need to pay attention for. So the first one is the component of Svelte. So this is a plain this is the typical Svelte component that you would write, just a normal Svelte component that has, that imports from Svelte, that has some functions, templates, head, and everything else over here. So index.js is what we're gonna fill in later on. So this is where we're gonna import the Svelte compiler API, and we're gonna use it to compile our code. But here, package.json. This is very common npm Node.js setup where you have a package.json where you specify all dependencies so that you can use them. Right here, I specify Svelte as my dependency, so I'm importing Svelte. So the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna import Svelte compiler and start compiling our Svelte code into JavaScript. So here I am going to index.js and I'm going to import the Svelte compiler. So this is the Svelte compiler from, require Svelte compiler. Okay, and of course I need to find this file. So I am going to use I'm going to read out the content of this file first so that I can compile them. So I am going to use fs, require fs. So fs is a built-in Node modules API that you can read content from a file. Also, I'm going to use path so that I can form a path for this component. So here, the path would be path to my component would be path.join current directory source component let's see. Okay. Then I would have next thing is that. Okay, hold on. Whoops, sorry. Let me wrap around. Okay. So next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to read the content. So fs.read file sync. I'm going to use a synchronous version of the read file so that I can just everything is like one line. We don't have to use promises, deal with promises and stuff. So here I'm going to read the file content. Encoding is UTF-8. Svelte code. So this is a Svelte code that we just read out from this file. And then the next thing is we're going to call Svelte compiler to compile our code. So let's take a look at how we can use this. So if you import Svelte compiler, you get a svelte.compile. So here's .compile. And then you pass in the code. So this is the code. And then you can pass in some options over here. So some of these options we've seen before. For example, like file name. Some of not file name, but some of them we've seen before, such as but in a episode when we talk about Svelte options, we say that Svelte options allows us to specify some of the Svelte compiler options. So these are the ones like immutable, accessors, custom elements, tag, right? These are the ones that we've seen before. So I'm not gonna go through them. But for file names and names would be what will be the class of the name of the class name of the Svelte components, right? So if you take a look at Svelte REPL over here, where we say that this is the JavaScript output, when you take a look, come over here, we see that app is the class name, right? So you can change this, you can specify what kind of class name it will be, and by default it will be component, right? So I'm not touching this, but this is like just to tell you like what you get if you would change this, right? So by default also, if you don't specify name, it will try to infer from file name, but file name by default is null if you don't specify. So file name, meaning if you specify file name and if you specify a file name, for example, in this case, our file name is the component.svelte, right? Then it probably would know that it will infer this as component is the class name, right? If our component name is say tab bar, then tab bar will be the class name. So if you don't have file name, then you're based on the name that you specify. So name by default is component if you don't specify one. If not, you can still change it. Let's say name is a scrollable list, right? Then the name will be the component class name will be scrollable list. Okay. So here we also have formats, which is ESM or CGS. This will change how the code will be exported, right? So things like okay, you can't change it here. So probably we'll continue and we'll take a look. We'll compare the difference of the output, and then we will take a look at it, right? So by default, I think we don't have to specify anything. We can come over here because most of the things has reasonable fallback, reasonable default. For example, format is ESM, generate this DOM, and things like that. So what you get out from here is gonna be JavaScript, CSS, AST warnings, variables, and stats. So a lot of things that you don't really need to know or care about. I think the most important one is the JavaScript and CSS. So JavaScript and CSS would be an object. So let's take a look. Let's just console out for the moment. Right, JavaScript and CSS. Note, let me zoom this up a bit as well. Okay. Node index.js. Okay, so now you see that the JavaScript will be an object that has code, which is the JavaScript code that you see, as well as a map, which is like a source map. So source map will be helpful for you if you want to do debugging later on, right? So this is the source map object that you probably would want to save it in a separate file. Yeah, as a separate file. Then CSS will also have two. It's also an object that has code as well as source map. Right. So first thing what we can do now is we just gonna save the JavaScript into a file. Right. So I'm gonna write this file. Write file sync, and I'm gonna create another path. So path name.join, and gonna maybe call output.js, and then the JavaScript.code, and the format is UTF-8. Right, I'm gonna save for CSS file as well, output.css. Okay, so let's run this again. We're done. Let's open our. You'll see that we have. Oops. I think I saved JavaScript code into the CSS file. Okay, now let's try run it again. Okay, we're done. Output CSS. We have a CSS file over here. Okay, JavaScript. We have a JavaScript file over here. Yeah, we have everything over here. Let's scroll all the way down. Yeah, this is the component. So by default, as I said, component name is component, right? So let's try to change that. So I can come over here and say, let's see, name equals to foo. Okay, let's try run that again. Okay, and now you see that output is foo. Right, let me try to just open both sides so that probably we can see it changing immediately, hopefully, if we have enough space. Okay, so a bit cramped, maybe not. Okay, so this is one thing we can change, the class name. And here you see that it's using ES modules. So it says export default foo. Okay, so let me interrupt for a bit. So you may ask me like, what does it matter for the class name? Well, most of the case it doesn't matter unless probably you are using something for some reason you maybe in the script module you have another context. You have something else over here. Like a class component or something, then maybe you are worried about conflict. But I will assure you that it doesn't really matter. Because the name is based on yes, you give a hint about the component name, but when you generate the output, it will still try to deconflict and prevent any conflict between between the code that you write and the code that the Svelte compiler is going to generate. Right, so you don't have to really worry about that. So it's mostly for nicely printing out the code where you have a nice class name. And also maybe when you print out the instance, some debugger will tell you that this extends from a certain class. And if all of the Svelte component class that you created are all named components, it's a bit hard to debug, I would say. So this is mainly for nicely printing out and nicely debugging. Right? So as I was saying that this output export default is ES modules. So you can change that. You can come over here and make a change, right? So we can see this is part of the format. So now if I change it to format to CGS, CommonJS, now if I run this again, you see that the output now changed to CommonJS, right? Previously it's export default something, now it's exports.default equals to something. This is the CommonJS export. So you still get .default so that when you import, no matter whether you are importing from a CommonJS file or like ES modules, I think your bundler will know how to handle this case where component will still be the .default export. So it could be the named default or like actual default export from ES modules. So next we have generate. I think we've seen this before, the last video when we talk about server-side rendering. So this will allow us to specify whether we are generating for a server-side rendering. So SSR. So this is the server-side rendering code, or it should be a code that run on the client side on the browser, right? So by default is DOM. Okay, so we have some def. This is to turn on or turn off some of the debugging codes that you have. So for example, if you use @debug, or if you are using a Svelte Chrome extension to do a Svelte debugger, this actually will, when you turn this on by default, actually has some sort will add extra code for you to for your code to talk to the Svelte Chrome extension. So here we've seen, yeah, I think it's best for me to just also show you that what are those codes. So if I def equals to true, I think it's true by default, but over here you probably see like things like add location, things like insert def. So it's a def version, which when you call this function internally, it will also inform the Svelte Chrome extension that, oh, you are inserting some elements over here. There's also some dispatch def, some def, some communication is happening from your code to the Svelte Chrome extension, right? So if you specify this as false, which you should if you are building for production, then all this code will not be generated, right? So you don't have this, all those codes will not be inserted into your compiled code, right? So here you can also have this flag turned on called legacy. So this will try to generate try as much as possible to generate code that will also work in IE 9 and IE 10. So try not to generate codes that is so there's a difference between using this and using Babel for you to do transpilation, right? So this will only ensure that the code that Svelte generates, Svelte injects, will also works in IE 9 and IE 10. But if you are yourself writing syntaxes that is not supported in IE 9 and IE 10, for example, if you are writing optional chaining, for example, those will not be converted to support for IE 9 and IE 10. You will need to pass this code that you have. For example, right now it's outputting a JavaScript code, right? So this code will be Svelte will inject some of the Svelte's code, so those will work for IE 9 and 10. But the code that you write will also be copied verbatim. So we don't do any transformation for those code except for like reactivity and stuff, right? So here, if you have code that is written for like newer browsers and you want to support older browsers, legacy browsers, then your JavaScript code over here, you probably will have to come over here and maybe do a Babel transform sync with a JavaScript code, and you get a transform. Maybe a like a Babel transform code over here, and you write this to your to the output, right? So if so this will help you to transform the rest of the code that you write into to JavaScript code that IE 9 or 10 or any browsers that you're targeting that supports them, right? So in this example, I'm not going to show here. I'll just leave it as it is. Okay, so the rest of the options are, I think you've seen before. Most of the things are pretty much self-explanatory, like the file name, output file name, CSS output file name, the Svelte path. So the Svelte path itself is interesting because this, right, if you come over here and take a look at the output code, it is importing from Svelte, right? Svelte internal, Svelte, and Svelte. Right, so this assumes that Svelte is available at this current location that you are putting your code to, right? So for example, and this is okay, and most of the case when you are using a bundler, because this but the bundler will know how to look for Svelte. And in our case also, I think we install Svelte in no module, so this is okay for us as well. But in rare cases that maybe your Svelte is in some other folders that you somehow, for some reasons, okay, you can change that. You can come over here and say Svelte path equals to XXX, right? Just for demonstration. Then you see that now instead of importing Svelte, you're importing XXX internal. So if you have a custom version of Svelte, or your Svelte is in certain folder somewhere, then you can have this, you can change this, and the rest of the code is still like normal, that how Svelte generates, right? So here, if we take a look at when we are generating for a DOM, you see that there's a function called add CSS. This will try to add the CSS into, so this function will be run when you are mounting your component, and this function will try to add a style element with the CSS that is generating, right? But we already have an output CSS file as well, right? Or this will also give us a CSS code that we can write in the CSS file as well. So it's up to us whether we want to have the CSS as like a separate file, or just let the JavaScript to just do it, right? So if by default, the JavaScript code that the Svelte generates will also take in charge of adding CSS to the DOM. So you don't have to worry about that. So yeah, but then if you don't want that, you don't want that extra code thing that has been generated by JavaScript, you don't want JavaScript to insert CSS, but rather you have an external, you want to get a CSS output and save it in an external file and include this CSS file in your HTML, right? If you want to do that, then what you need to do is you're going to come over here and specify CSS to false, right? So this is this option. It says over here, CSS false, then it will not be included in the JavaScript. So if I run this, probably see that now you don't have the add CSS function over here, right? The JavaScript will not take care of adding CSS. But of course, your component that you write will still have the class names, right? Those scoped class names. So it's up to you to figure out when you want to load your CSS. So you still can get your CSS output from here and try to write in a file or do whatever you want with it. But just make sure that you have it available so that at least your component is styled, right? There's another function called CSS hash. So this one, if you take a look over here, it says that it's a function that takes in a hash, CSS name, and file name, and you should return some a string, right? So what this means, so over here you see that CSS to do a scoping, we add some custom Svelte hash class names to your elements, right? In here it says Svelte dash and blah blah blah, right? So this hash is generated based on is a hash of your code that you've written. So every time when you change your code, it generates a different hash, right? And some people doesn't like the prefix called Svelte dash prefix, so you can change that. So this is a CSS hash function that can change these class names, right? So it's a function that so you just implement you specify a function that returns a string, and that string will be used instead. That string will be used instead of the default class name that Svelte provides, right? So by default, a hash is a function, and you can pass in a CSS or whatever, and then you generate this, right? This is the default Svelte class that Svelte generates, but you can change that. So for example, I'm gonna say I don't care about hash, I don't care about anything. I just want all my class to prefix with XYZ, okay? But you have to be careful with this. So everything prefixed with X, everything will be XYZ. Okay, let's take a look over here. So all your special scope class name will be XYZ. And what I say you have to be careful is that now if you have multiple components that has this class name then they are not scoped to just one component anymore, because all the components share this special unique class name, right? Previously, this class name also includes a hash that is unique to this component because it's generated based on this component, based on the code that you've written for this component. So if you don't have that, then it's a bit it's a bit worrying that your scoping may not work, right? So so it's recommended that you use the hash function to generate some hash, right? So you have a hash, you have CSS, you have name and file name, right? So this name and file name is the one that is being passed over here. Previously, we say we can specify name and file name, right? Of course, so here we're gonna say this plus maybe a hash CSS. Let's try run. Oops. Let's see. So at least now you have some hash injected as well. Or maybe you don't like XYZ, you can it's totally up to find. So this is customizable. It's really up to you what you want. You can have a hash only, and if you find that hash is too long, you can change it, but you have to be careful, right? Just make sure that there's enough characters to make sure that the possibility of collision is very, very low. Right? If you only have like one character, imagine you only have like A to Z and 0 to 9. That's like 36 characters, and it's very high probability, like 1 in 36 chance to get collision. Right? I hope I get my maths correct. So anyway, okay, I think my maths should be as long as by pigeonhole principle more than 36. If you have 37 components, then you will have two components that will have collision, right? So here we have some other flags that are just for developer that is turned on for developer mode. For example, loop guard timeout. This one is, we added this for the REPL. For example, if you accidentally added a while loop that never ends, this will try to throw an error for if your loop goes more than like how many cycles or something like that, right? So this will, if your loop goes more than like a certain period of time, so this guards the loop. So you want to have this if you have a loop, if you, just in case your code will like infinite looping and freeze up the whole browser. But this is mostly for developer actually, right? Because once your code is written, you tested it, most likely you don't have any infinite loop happening, right? I believe in you. So here are some other things, like say whether you want to preserve your comments or you want to preserve some white space in between elements and things like that. And I think that's most of the options that you can do with your Svelte compile. Right, so that's about Svelte compilation. So I think we still didn't cover hydration, because we said that we're gonna do like one specific video just on hydration only. So we're gonna leave it to that. So in that video, we probably would take a look at how we can compile the codes for hydration, prepare your code for hydration, and how does that works. Right, so I will probably see you in that video. So if you like this video, give me a thumbs up. If you have any questions you would like to ask about compiler API, feel free to comment down below. And as always, subscribe to my channel so that you get notified when the next video is out. So see ya, bye bye.